All right, it's a wrap on the 2025 Barrett Media Top 20. Jason Barrett, President, Barrett Media, is with me. I think this is a Mizzou Penn State pregame show here. JB, you look pretty good for a guy who's just done three of these for the first time.
Yeah, it's been a long what is it, 4 or 5 weeks that we've been rolling these out, and that's not taking into account my entire holiday break, and the month of December is spent creating the list, sending it over to people, having to track people down to vote. So yeah, it's been a lengthy 2 month, 2.5 month process, but hopefully everybody that saw the lists across news talk, music, and sports felt good about it. I thought we really highlighted the industry in a positive light. Hopefully that's what most took away from it. I know the competitive juices get flowing and someone wants to be higher and all that, and that's fun, but at the same time, when you look at it from the standpoint that I do, 220 stations, shows, and PDs in news talk, 220 in sports, and 320 in music. I mean, over the span of 5 weeks, what is that? 760 different, categories and
Wow.
results. I mean, it's pretty impressive. And so I want to thank, before I forget, Steve Stone voiceovers, Radio.Cloud, and JJ Surma voiceovers. We need support to make these things work. All three were fantastic to work with. And I hope the industry supports them back because they do this to support the industry themselves.
Yeah, no, it's a great thing. And I know from being in buildings, people absolutely love it. And speaking of buildings I've been in, we're going to start with last Monday and kick off with the morning shows for the mid markets. And the winner is somebody that I've worked with before, is Cole Kublik, who works with Greg McElroy at Jocks. And Jocks is just such a great station. This is a national college football show
Mhm.
that they do every day. That's what the audience wants. They do a great job 3 years in a row at number one.
Yeah, I mean, they're a dominant force in this category. Big brand. To your point, they have a national profile. So Greg and Cole are well regarded and respected. They have great chemistry on that show, a lot of rating success with that show. I don't know all the revenue, but I'm guessing they're probably important to jocks, right? So no surprise there. When I look at the mid-market category, a couple things jumped out. First of all, I was really happy for Mac and Bone because WFNZ this year is on FM. It's now been about a year and a half, and they are crushing in Charlotte. And I don't know that that's known the way that it should be, probably on a higher level, but those guys are more than deserving to be in the top three. A show that you and I both know, and I've had to deal with the ups and downs of this list in the past. The morning after, congrats to those guys. They finally got on, and when they did, they made it count. They finished fourth. Now, you could debate this because they got in November, which means they didn't have, the full year. But I think that's a testament that the talent was always there. It's a really successful, Tim McKernan in St. Louis is really successful. When you're on a standalone brand sometimes that doesn't have a lot of rating success, even though your show may be just as good as anyone else's, those things, when voters come into play, they tend to vote for the shows and the stations that are owned by the larger companies. And so that hurts some standalones sometimes, which is the unfortunate part. But those guys, now they're under a Hubbard wing. They're on a major station, 101 ESPN. And so it was cool to see them get their due. A couple that you could easily make a case were ranked too low. Morning Juice at number 10. If you look at 97.1 The Fan across all categories, they were much higher. And Bobby Carpenter's a talented guy. So that one surprised me at 10. You could say the same if you're Steve Saban or the Morning Animals on WWLS. I think both of those were, should have been a little higher. When you look at on the major market side, Dave, Boomer and Geo still on top. No surprise. They're a dominant morning show at WFAN. Really good program. I didn't really have an issue on the top five. You could debate, this one should be two or three and all that stuff. But the five top shows I thought were well represented. A few other things that jumped out to me in the major markets. You could really see the impact that Greg Hill has on WEEI and Brock and Salk have on Seattle Sports 710. those were the top shows from those stations, and they weren't represented in other categories, which means they're really important. I think Denver morning radio for sports is excellent. Both the Fan and Altitude have great shows. I think you could easily make a case they're not voted as high as they should be. And then the last couple things I have were Ben and Woods and Payne and Pendergast have been on this list before and got left off. I think you could easily make a case they should be on. And the real surprise to me, and look, I know there's been a lot of negative attention over the last year, so this might play into it, but Murph and Mac used to be a top 10 show on KMBR in this list, and KMBR wasn't even in the top 20 on this list. Now, is that just because people have the perception that KMBRs went through change? Probably. It's not like Brian Murphy got less talented. So we'll see how that goes next year. But those were the things that jumped out to me in the morning. Anything that surprised you or that got your attention?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, and you hit on them both, but I just wanted to add, Steve Zabin is awesome. He's underrated. He's just I've written about him before. There's just so much energy in a show, and you talked about the morning after, and those guys are so talented. I'm most excited because Tim McKernan is great. He's been great in this format for a long time. He's invented things in this format. And so I'm happiest for those guys because now more people in the industry will get to hear them. And what I mean by that are content creators, right? Other creators will get to hear what they do because it's different than what a lot of other people do. So they've been really successful at that. So congrats to those guys. As we move to midday and start with the mid markets, pretty cool story with first time winner and very deserving.
Yeah, Rothman and Ice on 97.1. The Fan went number one, as you mentioned, first time. I'm sure Buck Racing at the Zone wasn't happy because he's been like right there, and his show is excellent, and he does really well. And so Buck definitely has a case there, but kudos to the boys in Columbus on getting it done. They had to feel especially great, Matt Fishman and his brand, that Bishop and Friends was also in the top five, their other midday show. So very strong representation for Columbus. Dan Dockich returned to the list. He went back to radio on a smaller brand, 1430 and Indy. Well respected still by voters. And then Josh and Swain got in at number 20, which was a nice surprise. I'm sure it ticked off Eric Ainge, who's usually got on from the station. But hey, look, kudos to Josh and Swain. On the major market side, Zoe and Bertrand own this category. They've been dominating it for years. Now, there was one interesting nugget here. Brandon Tierney and Sal Licata cut their lead in half this year from the prior year. So as we look at next year, if both shows continue to do well, I'm interested to see how that plays out. Do they get closer? Because FAN has the reputation. You look at mornings, Boomer and Geo beat Toucher and Hardy. So, that's probably the one that Zoe and Bertrand have to keep their eye on. I thought the top five, again, overall, very fair, really good across the board. Mike Missinelli came back to the Fanatic. He's now in middays as opposed to afternoons. He was number 14 in his debut back. I would expect next year, if he puts a full year in and continues to do what he does, I would expect him to be higher. And then one that I just have to, this is a pet peeve. I don't get it. And I know you have a high opinion of these guys too. Cellini and Domino should be on this list. They never get on. It might be the standalone station deal. I've known Chris Domino as a talent for 20 years. That guy is excellent. And for whatever reason, when these lists come out, Atlanta does really well. Look, I'm not saying that 92.9 The Game shouldn't have shows on. They should. They absolutely deserve that with Andy and Randy and with Steak and Sandra. And so this is, if anything, there should be three because the Fan in Atlanta has a really good midday show as well. And so that was the only one that I'm the guy who has to add it up. And believe me, that's the hard part when you do these results. You gather the votes and you go, again? What are you guys missing? So that's my only gripe in the top 20 for middays.
Yeah, that was exactly the one, that I was going to point to in that category. Congratulations to Rothman and Ice. I got a chance to catch up with them while they were at the Super Bowl. They were super excited, which was great. I think the world of what Matt Jones and those guys do in Kentucky, I think they're fantastic. And as you said, I think the top of that is, it's really, really good. And so you can kind of mix those guys up when you go to afternoons, though, especially on the mid market side, 93.7 The Fan, they get awfully comfortable in that spot.
Pony and Muller, this is a three-peat for them. The funny thing is, I'll see this every year when these come out, and they get a lot of love from the people who love them. And then there's the critics, who don't like the show, and they'll go, Barrett must work for them. I don't work for the Fan. Let's just put that on the record. You know why they get voted that well? Because Pony and Muller are really damn good, and they have great chemistry, great ratings, and really strong respect in the industry. Andrew Filipponi is a star. So is Chris Muller. So, Pittsburgh has a great sports radio station. By the way, that's no knock on Mark Madden, who's also dominant in the category. You could easily argue Mark Madden's too low at number 11, okay? That being said, those guys were deserving of the top spot. You look at some of the others, I'm looking at my list. I was glad for this guy because I think he's a really talented host. You'll know him well, Surem Petro. He was at number 4, which was definitely a surprise. That's high. But if you've paid attention to his work over the years, you know that he's had a really good connection in Kansas City. I was happy to see JMB crack the top 10 in Indy. His ratings are excellent. He's a really unique, entertaining talent. Just great connection with his audience. And so to see him do well was nice. I was happy for the Frangie show to finally get on. I've known Frank Frangie for a long time. And in years past, they would be on the outside looking in. And so to get in at 19 was cool. On the major market side, look, Felger and Maz, just like Zoe and Bertrand, but even at a more dominant level, those guys just run afternoons. Now, you could make a case if you just base the show on the originality and the listening, forget all the revenue, forget all the ratings, you can make a case Mike Valenti is just as good, if not better. Okay, those two in the top 2 spots, no argument whatsoever. I saw Derek did some videos down at Media Row. And I love the video that the WIP guys had. I love you, Spike. I love the passion. I know he felt 5 was too low. They can make that case, given their performance there. Let's remember one thing, though. Spike, you just got there in March, okay? Like, come next year, and then if you're still in 5 next year, you got a more legitimate gripe. That being said, I know he'll battle with Evan and Tiki. That said, the Hardline in Dallas, that show is equally as deserving. Those guys at the ticket do some kick-ass radio and high ratings and high revenue. And so, again, semantics. You could pick this, and this. I was happy for Ron Hughley and Clint Sterner in Houston. They finally got on to hear the joy. By the way, incredible prank last week. Those guys are on Media Row. And I think their PD, Parker Hillis, sat down a guy and they thought it was Stephon Diggs, and they interview him for 7 minutes to discover he's not Stephon Diggs. Very well done. And so I was happy for those guys. I'll say this though, Dave. I've done these results for 10 years. Every year and it doesn't matter if you change voters and new PDs come into the process. Every year, Miami, San Diego, Houston, and Seattle are all towards the back, struggling to try to get in. And usually in the past, they had a challenge getting in because WEEI in Boston was typically in there. The Fan in Denver was typically in there. And Tampa, even back when it was Ronnie and T-Crass, they would do well. And kudos to the voters for recognizing, because the guys in some of those markets, Miami, San Diego, Houston, Seattle, they're deserving. And so it's cool to see some new blood there, but, next year will be a different year probably.
Yeah. I got to shout out a couple of my guys You mentioned Ron the Show Hughley coming in. Those guys were excited. That was great to see. Ron's terrific at what he does. He worked in Kansas City before he was there. And speaking of Kansas City, my guy Carrington Harrison at number 12, that's entirely too low. Top 10 at the very least.
Yep.
But yes, Soren Petro does a great job in Kansas City as well. And one other that I don't know, but he's from St. Louis, my hometown, and he works for a station that's near and dear to me, Gabe Kuhn, who does a great job down in Memphis. That's a great radio station, 92.9 down there. Brad Carson and the gang, they all do a terrific job. So we move on to the next category of national sports shows. And number one at the top 2 years in a row, the man, I just wrote about him today. I think he's doing some of his best stuff. And I say he, and it's them, Dan Patrick and the Danettes at number one.
Yeah, look, DP, I worked with him 20 years ago, and what you learned working on the show is just eye-opening. When it was like a crash course in an education in sports radio, just a brilliant talent and great production team. Those guys deserve their credit. Here's the thing. If you look at the top six, all of them are deserving of where they're at, right? You had DP, Colin, Chris Russo, Rich Eisen, and Jim Rome, and then Paul Feinbaum. Like you want to debate one or two slots. Like I've been a Mad Dog fan for my whole life. I could argue he's the best talent in America, but I'm not going to say that DP's not or that Colin's not. They're all great, right? And so this category, I think typically you see a lot of the top five, top six are pretty strong and belong in the category that they're in. Where I think there's some things that I was glad got corrected. I will tell you, last year was probably the first time I was pissed off putting something out. Adam Shine was 18th last year.
Oh, wow.
That was BS. Okay. I added up the votes and I'm like, I went through it like 3 or 4 times. I'm like, there's no way. This is not the 18th best national show. To see him at number 9 this year, that felt more reflective. You can make a case Shines in 7, 8 as well. Greene this year, he's in at number 7. Look, Mike missed a bunch of time on the show. So it's fair to say, like, if he's in there all the time, you could argue he's a top 5. With missing some of the show, you could argue 7 was high. Either way, here's what's going to be interesting. Next year, he's not in this category because he left the radio show. So how does that affect ESPN radio moving forward? So that'll be interesting to keep an eye on. DA and Babchick were ranked high. They were at number 8. Those guys are super entertaining. I'm a big Damon Amendola fan. Babchick is nuts, and I mean that in the best way possible. He laugh out loud funny. And so those guys being at number 8 was cool. I think the story, though, of this category is Fox Sports Radio. They owned 7 of the top 20. And you could argue and make a case that the Odd Couple got snubbed. Okay. And if they are on this list, that's 8, which is incredible, right? Now, I'll say this, there were some great other stories like Maggie and Perloff keep moving up. It was cool to see Zach Gelb finally sneak on the list. I think ESPN Radio's got some shows that are building and are going to do well in the future, the morning show being one of them. But I will, the one point I want to make, SiriusXM's shows, I think often get overlooked if they're not on Mad Dog Radio. They've got some excellent programming on other channels that doesn't get the respect in this category the way that I think it should. So it's become a more terrestrial world. And when you have terrestrial voters, and we do have some folks from Sirius who take part. And so it's not like they're absent in it, but they're probably not enough to outweigh the terrestrial side of things. So those were my takeaways. Yours?
Yeah, the Fox Sports Radio thing is interesting in 2 ways. One, it's interesting to see right now how many that they have on there. But when you go through them and you think about it, Dan Patrick's done at the end of 2027. We know that for sure. Where will Colin Cowherd be long term? Will he still be with Fox Sports Radio or Fox, period? Is an interesting question. And then one of the others that's on there is Doug Gottlieb, who's also the head basketball coach of the worst college basketball team in America. So at some point,
Doug.
he's picking one or the other, which is sort of what I think a lot of us predicted from the get go. It's going to be really hard to do both, but that's interesting to see too, from the standpoint that they're really strong right now, but the future's got some question marks.
That being said, right now, when you got to line up with DP, Colin, Gottlieb, Jason Smith, Ben Maller, Cavino and Rich, Brady Quinn, LeVar Arrington, and Jonas Knox, they're in really good shape.
Yep. Yep. Let's move to our program directors and starting with mid market. I mentioned Brad Carson before, but taking a look at the top five, admittedly, I don't know Paul Mason's work quite as well as the others, but what a strong top five with Brad Carson, Ryan Haney, Matt Fishman, Paul, who I mentioned, and Chad Boger in Kansas City.
Yeah, look, I don't think you could argue the top five. You can always change one or two here or there. Brad Carson's excellent, well deserving of that. Ryan Haney's won this award before, very deserving as well. You mentioned you don't know Paul. I do. Paul is excellent. And so, you could easily make a case Paul's as good as Brad or Ryan. And so these guys, best of the best in the mid market. On the major side, Jimmy Powers winning for the ticket in Detroit, well deserved. He's a outstanding PD who's done a lot of great work for a long time in Detroit. Look, that's not to take anything away from Rick Radzik, Jeff Catlin, Mitch Rose, and Rod Lake, and all of those guys have a case to be made as well that they're, best in class. So I think the top five on both sides, really strong. A few of the notes that I had here is I thought it was great to see Brian Long at number 11. He did a great job at Arizona Sports. He had already done great work in San Diego and Seattle prior to that. Now he's moved since in January to Los Angeles to run KFI and AM 570. So what I think will be interesting next year, KFI is the cream of the crop in news talk, but 570 for some reason always struggles to get into the top 20. So does he get punished the same way others have when it comes to the sports side and get elevated on the news talk? We'll see. I think you can make a case. Ryan Hurley at 10 for WFAN, too low. I think Andy Roth at 17, someone who's won the mid-market category a bunch, probably too low at 17, but he did just get there, and I think it was August. Ryan took the reins at FAN, I think, in March or April. And so with another year, similar to what I said earlier about spiking the guys at WIP and afternoon, I think you'll see Hurley and Roth rise up the ranks next year. And the last two that I had on the mid-market side, Matt Moscona debuted very high. I think you would agree that session at the summit probably didn't hurt him. Some people who vote were taking notes going, this guy knows his stuff. And so it's good to see because he's extremely sharp. And then I know Jeff Rickard and the work he's done in Charlotte and Indy. And remember, he's got two brands in the mid-market category, something that like Paul Mason has a news talk and a sports talk too. But I can make a case Jeff should be higher. 92.7 WFNZ in Charlotte had a hell of a year. The Fan in Indy does extremely well. And so those were my key takeaways on the PD side. What were yours?
Yeah, I think we talked about sort of the mid market already in terms of the top five and how they can sort of be interchangeable on the major market side. Rick Radzik probably should just be permanently in number one, even if we always have a number 1A. That station is just, they're so good. They're represented obviously everywhere at the top. You mentioned Ryan Hurley. My guess is he'll be higher on the list in years to come. So there's still a lot of really really good program directors. Is what my takeaway was. I know they probably feel maybe as they're not as celebrated maybe as they once were. But so I'm glad we recognize them. And then today we ended with stations in the top 20 and in the mid market. The thing that really just stands out to me is how good sports radio is in the mid markets. That's a lot of really good radio stations.
Yeah, you look at the top five, you had WJOX, Jocks, 97.1 The Fan, 104.5 The Zone, 92.3 The Fan was number five, and 101 ESPN was number four. I mean, those are five great radio stations with strong success in each of their respective cities. And so mid markets, the top five felt right. I really didn't have that much of an issue with any of the top 20. I will tell you, I was glad to see 1010XL move up to 15. I've known those guys a long time, have a lot of relationships there. And, I tell them all the time, like, look, the industry's got to decide your fate. I can't. But I know how hard they work and how talented they are. And so to see that recognition was cool. I think the same could be said about Moscona Station 105, 104.5 ESPN in Baton Rouge. When you have a top 10 performing morning show and a top 10 afternoon show and a top 10 PD, it means people are paying attention and you're doing something right. And by the way, that's a brand that doesn't have Nielsen ratings. And you know what? That's okay. By the way, that's the one thing I think some people misconstrue about the voting process. They think it's just about ratings. It's about originality, multi-platform presence, industry buzz. In the case of national shows, clearance, ratings, revenue. And then, by the way, how your peers see you. And so, when you have a great radio station, just because if they subscribe to Nielsen, they probably do really well in their market. But if they don't think it's a worthwhile business expense, doesn't make their station any less formidable, right? On the major market side, you look at the top five, I thought it felt right. You had the Hub, the Ticket, WFAN, the Ticket in Detroit, and then WIP. I mean, all five of those have a gripe that they're the best in the business. And as you said before with Radzik, the Hub, could lay claim to number one every year. They're just a incredible radio station. But I thought it was great to see the Ticket in Dallas do really well, because the Ticket in Dallas does outstanding. By the way, that market, it's funny because if you look at it from a rating standpoint, it's good. I don't know that it gets enough attention the way that some others do. Like in Boston, we talk about the Hub and EEI at a different level than we talk about the Ticket and 105.3 The Fan. Both of those stations and PDs and shows are typically in the top 6 to 8. And so that's a really strong sports radio market. And then, FAN, IP, the Ticket in Detroit, all great brands as well.
Yeah, it's you mentioned the Ticket. Again, it's just it's consistent. It's consistently been a great radio station. Almost since the day that it started. Same thing with the Sports Hub. One of the big stories, of course, of the year was David Fields stepping down from Odyssey. Many would point to that decision as one of the biggest ones that changed a lot, picking the wrong station in Boston when they had the choice. So again, a lot of great radio stations. You can put a lot of those top five, add the Score, add the Fan in Washington, and kind of shake them up, and how they come out. They're all really, really good radio stations. So not a ton of surprises on the stations. It's great to see them all recognized. But yeah, as I said, I mean, the mid market is really strong. I think you could put the top five there against any of the major ones and be in those categories. And that's not necessarily the same all throughout. So another incredibly strong year. I'll give you the last word as we wrap up.
I just want to thank everyone who followed along, shared the content on social, talked about it on the air, talked about it on digital. Everyone who voted, our partners, Radio.Cloud, Steve Stone voiceovers, and JJ Surma voiceovers, as well as those who just love the radio business and want to see it do well. That's the one thing I tried to make this point in my column today on barrettmedia.com, that so much, while it's fun to debate, I should be 8 or 9 or 6 or 5, that's the fun stuff and your competitive juices get going. But the bigger takeaway is that this radio industry is still very formidable, big, successful. And when you've got, 15,000 radio stations across America still pumping out content, and you look at how many great shows, brands, and PDs were celebrated over the last month across all formats, I mean, it reminds you you're in a pretty great business. Don't let the negative headlines about the industry shake your enthusiasm. If you just want to talk about revenues declining, we could do that all day. That doesn't mean you don't make a ton of revenue, right? It doesn't mean that fans listening to your product don't love sports radio, music radio, or news talk radio. And so I made the point in the column, and I hope more PDs and hosts do this. Share the results with your advertisers, with media buyers, not just your social followers and your friends that work in the business. Let your clients know, hey, we're building a winner here. We're doing great things. The industry knows. I don't think they're going to take your revenue from 100,000 to 1 million just because you cracked the top 20 on Barrett Media's list. But look, people are impressionable. When they see that there's buzz surrounding something and you've earned it by getting voted on, they're likely to say, you know what, that's a brand I want to be in business with. So don't just get into your, tunnel vision and look at it from hey, this is cool in the studio. Think about how it, make sure your GM and your executives know when your contract comes up and you've been on this in the top 5 for the last 5 years, you're reminding them that, hey, I put wins on the board. And so you got to constantly do that stuff. And some don't like to promote themselves, Dave, which we're selling content on the air all the time, yet we're terrified of selling ourselves. But you have to sell yourself and the brand and the success you've earned, because if you don't do it, nobody's going to.
You nailed it.